Welcome to the next block of teaching on FR1, which deals with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discours sur l'inégalité. My name is Michael Moriarty, and I will be delivering 3 lectures on this text. Dr. Manda will then be delivering a commentary. This lecture will be divided into 2 parts, corresponding to PowerPoint presentations. In the first part, I'll give you a brief introduction to Rousseau. I'll say what the lectures will be doing, and I'll say something about forms of inequality in 18th century France. So, Rousseau called himself, on the title page of this book, a citoyen de Genève, a citizen of Geneva. And one of the most important things about this great figure in French literature, then, is that he's not French. Geneva was an independent republic within the Helvetic Confederation, and it was a rich but a socially divided city. Rousseau was born into a family of so-called citizens, and only about a third of adult males enjoyed this status, so on one level he's in the fortunate minority. And these citizens are entitled to membership of the legislative assembly of the city, the Conseil Général. But above them was an aristocracy that monopolized political office, and in particular the Petit Conseil, the executive body. So Rousseau is on the wrong side of that divide, and throughout his life he never identifies with the elites, always with the marginal figures. Rousseau left Geneva when he was only 16 in 1728, and after a series of adventures which he recounts in his Confessions, he established himself in France, where he made a name as an author and at first a composer. He wrote a fantastically successful opera called Le Devin du Village, and might have become a celebrity at this point when he turned his back on social success. Geneva was a Protestant city. Rousseau converted to Catholicism after leaving Geneva, but in later life returned to his original religion, albeit in a somewhat diluted form. And the Discours sur l'inégalité has this personal connection. It's dedicated to the Republic of Geneva, that's to say, the Conseil Général, and it contains a eulogy of the Genevan system of government. That didn't sufficiently ingratiate the authorities of Geneva to decide them to let him back into the city. And he continued to live in France. He had to flee in 1762 because his book, Émile, a treatise on education, was condemned by various authorities, chiefly for being mildly religiously subversive. Eventually he managed to return to France. He died in 1778. His major works can be classified under 5 headings: the criticism of contemporary culture, the Discours sur les sciences et les arts, which is often called the first discourse, the Inequality being the second discourse, the preface to Narcisse, and a letter to the mathematician d'Alembert sur les spectacles, which is about theatre, the plan to establish theatre in Geneva, which Rousseau is very hostile to. The second branch of his work is anthropology and political philosophy, and that contains the Discours sur l'inégalité, his great work of political theory, du contrat social, and the Essai sur l'origine des langues. The relationship between that essay and the Discours sur l'inégalité is a very complicated question, and I don't propose to go into it here. He also wrote a remarkably successful novel called Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse, which is an extremely long novel in letters, and a work I've already mentioned, Émile, which gives his very innovative theory of education and sets forth his moral and religious philosophy. And partly to vindicate himself against the hostility his writings had aroused, he wrote a series of autobiographical works. First of all, the Confessions, and after the Confessions, the most important is his last work, Les Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire, where he records his thoughts as on the walks he takes around Paris or walks from an earlier stage of his life. Now, the approach in these 3 lectures will be not literary. I shall not be focusing on the literary qualities of the text, which I'm sure Dr. Manda will do justice. My approach will be rather that of intellectual history. And studying intellectual history is like entering a room with many people obviously engaged in an ongoing conversation. You can hear what someone's saying, but you can't make sense of it because you don't know what they're replying to or what the other people will make of it. The intellectual historian sees Rousseau as joining in a long-running conversation, which is still going on today. And the intellectual historian aims to make sense of his words in the light of what the other participants have been saying before him and indeed after. Now, I'm going to give you a list of some of the other participants, the people who before Rousseau had taken part in this conversation. Doesn't matter whether you've heard of them or not. Some of you may have heard of them and may know something about them. Others not. It doesn't matter. I will provide the necessary information. And you don't have to discuss their theories in themselves. All you have to do is to understand what Rousseau thought of their theories. So here are some of the principal political theorists relevant to the Discours sur l'inégalité. The Athenian philosopher Plato, author of The Republic, which sets out a model for an ideal society. His rival Aristotle, who wrote about politics and virtually everything else as well, from zoology to metaphysics. Then the Roman orator and statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero, who, as well as writing any number of political and legal speeches and treatises on oratory, wrote 2 works on politics, The Republic and The Laws. And then a Roman poet of roughly the same time as Cicero, called Titus Lucretius Carus, who wrote a poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which sets out a particular philosophy inspired by the Greek thinker Epicurus. Moving on a long way, we come to the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, whose main treatises from our point of view are De Cive, On the Citizen, and Leviathan. His views were contested by the philosopher Robert Filmer, whose, in fact, his Filmer's work on politics was published after his death and after Hobbes's work on politics. Filmer, in his turn, was challenged by John Locke, author of 2 treatises of government, also very important in other branches of philosophy. His essay concerning human understanding is one of the most important works of the age. And finally, Charles de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, normally just called Montesquieu, a French philosopher, author of De l'Esprit des Lois, a study of the nature of law. And all of these writers are explicitly or implicitly alluded to by Rousseau. So in the first of these 3 lectures, I'll talk about the Discours sur l'inégalité as a speculative history of humanity. I'll talk about the problem discussed by Rousseau and the method he adopts to solve it. And I'll go on to present you with Rousseau's description of humanity in what he calls the state of nature. In Lecture 2, I'll talk about his analysis of how human beings emerged from the state of nature and came to form societies. And in Lecture 3, I'll talk about the Discours as a critique of modern society and about its broader implications. Now, before I begin to do that, let me say this. I think Rousseau's views are important and his argumentative method intellectually fascinating. This doesn't mean I expect you to agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything he says. I certainly don't expect you to. For instance, in one of the most important notes of the text, he condemns homosexual activity. We would call his views homophobic, though they were then complicated, and Rousseau's own sexuality is about as complicated as it can get, but I'm not going to talk about that. But I would also point out, and this is important, that his history has little room for female agency, and his views on gender relationships were hardly what we would call progressive, and they were criticised by the great English feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who admired his work in many respects, but not in this one. I want to draw your attention also to his use of the word savages. We imagine that when you talk of people as savages, you are talking in a pejorative spirit. You're saying they're not fit to live, they should be enslaved and so forth. Rousseau is not using the word in that sense. Etymologically, the word means forest dwellers, and he uses it because in the 18th century, it was the word savage was the conventional opposite term to civilized. But civilized for Rousseau is not an unambiguously positive term. So you mustn't foist onto Rousseau the attitudes of a sort of 19th century explorer, bringing the benefits of civilization to supposedly to ignorant savages. Rousseau's attitude to the people he calls savages is actually more positive than negative. So, what is Rousseau doing in the Discours sur l'inégalité? Well, it's actually something like an exam question, and Rousseau answers the questions set. The Académie de Dijon, a learned society in Burgundy, had a regular essay prize, and Rousseau won the prize one year with a work called the Discours sur les sciences et les arts. In this work, he challenged the prevailing Enlightenment belief that the growth of knowledge and cultural development makes humankind happier and morally better. And he picks up these themes in the Discours sur l'inégalité, which he also entered for the Dijon competition, although this time he didn't win. Now, the text gives an account of the development of human beings from earliest origins. And we might ask whether this can still be of interest when we know much more about human evolution, prehistory, zoology, anthropology, and so on. And modern-day anthropologists don't turn to Rousseau when they want to understand inequality. There is a huge corpus of modern literature on the origin of inequality. But I think we shouldn't judge the Discours as a crude attempt to do what we can do better. We should see it in its context as an 18th century solution to a problem we have not solved. Inequality is a very live issue in modern societies, and I would say to you that modern British society is far more unequal than the society that I grew up in the 1970s. So the competition question has two parts. What is the origin of inequality among human beings, and is it authorised by the natural law? And Rousseau answers both parts of the question. I'll explain what natural law means in due course. The answer to the first part is conditioned by the question in the second part. So this renders an objection, which is that Rousseau's account of human development doesn't correspond to what we think actually happened. That objection, in a sense, is irrelevant. Rousseau's account of human development will work if it enables him to answer the problem of whether human inequality is in accordance with the natural law. And it will work even if it doesn't correspond to the facts. Well, if we're going to understand Rousseau's answer, we need to understand the question he's dealing with. Quelle est l'origine de l'inégalité parmi les hommes? Let's stick to the first part of the question for the moment. Well, there are different kinds of inequality between human beings: physical, economic, political, and social. There's inequality between social groups, between genders, between races, and so forth. What kinds of inequality prevailed in 18th century France? First of all, there was political inequality. There was an absolute hereditary monarch, although he ruled in keeping with fundamental laws. That's to say, there were some laws of the kingdom to which the monarch had to adhere. For instance, male succession was a fundamental law. The monarch couldn't say, but my daughter's much cleverer than my son, I'd rather she came after me. Whereas in other kingdoms at the time, or empires at the time, females could succeed. For instance, the great 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century had one great ruler, Maria Theresia. And the subjects had no political rights as subjects. They're not citizens legally. Their rights relate only to the social categories to which they belong. The monarch was backed up by powerful ministers and officials, and sometimes backed up by institutions called the Parlement. Now, the Parlement were not what we think of as a parliament. They didn't make the law. They were supreme courts, and their judge was to register and uphold the law. Okay, and sometimes they exert what sociologists sometimes call a countervailing power to the monarch. They oppose certain lines of action that they think are, by the monarch, that they think contrary to the law of the land. Social inequality, then, French society was in theory divided into three orders or estates. First of all, the clergy, then the nobility, and thirdly, everyone else. Okay, and your membership of an estate was largely determined by birth. Okay, and the first two estates had privileges. They were exempt from most kinds of taxation. They were entitled to deference from people of inferior rank. And they had a degree of impunity from the law. For instance, Voltaire, who had offended a nobleman, was beaten up by the nobleman's servants. There was no way he could get any legal redress from this action. And Rousseau's own father had a rather similar experience. When he came into conflict with a sort of Genevan aristocratic figure who had friends in high places. It's not enough, of course, to talk about France in itself. We've got to think that the French kingdom had colonies built on slavery. Okay. Of course, many non-European societies involved slavery as well. But the French economy certainly depended on slavery. Now, there was an immense gap between the rich and the poor. The rich would be landowners, mostly aristocrats, sometimes financial administrators, what called in those days tax farmers, people who collected the taxes for the crown. Some merchants were wealthy, especially if they were involved in the slave trade. And the poor, peasants with small holdings and landless labourers. In between, there's a middle class of professionals, merchants and tradespeople, which itself is strongly hierarchical. As regards gender, women in theory were subordinate to their fathers and their husbands. They enjoyed legal autonomy only as widows. I mean, a widow could run a business, for instance. There are some examples of that, the book trade and, in fact, the champagne trade as well. In upper class and upper middle class society, what people at the time might call polite society, women in fact enjoyed considerable social influence through institutions like the salon and a fair degree of personal autonomy. Within the family, the husband and father was the head. And in general, age was regarded as a title to respect, contrary to modern ageism, which usually involves discrimination against the old. There's also religious inequality. France was officially a Roman Catholic country. Protestants and Jews did not enjoy the right to worship. Blasphemy was punishable by death, though some known unbelievers figured in polite society, and Rousseau knew some of them, like his sometime friend, the philosopher Diderot. And then racial inequality, well, I've already mentioned slavery, and some justifications of slavery argued that it was justified because black people were intrinsically inferior. And this is a view satirized by Montesquieu in Book 15, Chapter 5 of De l'Esprit des Lois. He argues that racial difference does not in any way entitle one to enslave another person. Now, when we think about modern categories of discrimination, we sometimes think about sexual orientation, for instance, and they don't apply to the 18th century in entirely the same way. Same-sex activity, especially between men, was criminalised, and it could even be punished by death, although in practice the privileged were likely to be left alone, and this is a topic that Professor Hammond has brilliantly explored in some of his work. But it's not clear that people, at least aristocrats, were discriminated against simply because of their sexual orientation. Many key generals of the late 17th and early 18th century were known to prefer sex with men. The Maréchal de Villars, the Maréchal de Vendôme, and the great Eugène of Savoy, who was Duke of Marlborough's colleagues in the wars against France. So Rousseau especially concentrates on economic and political inequality. His views on gender, as I've said already, are conservative. It would be possible to rethink his theories along feminist lines, but in presenting them initially, it would be misleading to correct their gender bias. Okay. So in the second part of this lecture, I will discuss different explanations that had been put forward for human inequality, and I'll explain why Rousseau finds them inadequate.